The RCMP's role in the Indian residential school system.
The first residential school in Canada opened before Confederation, and the last school closed in 1996. For 150 years, the residential schools were a fundamental part of the Canadian government's plan to assimilate Aboriginal people into Canadian white culture and control them. RCMP records reveal clear involvement in residential schools through recruitment, transportation, help beyond police duties, support given to organizations and agencies, social visits, and law enforcement. According to the RCMP, action taken was usually initiated by school staff and Indian agents. This timeline shows key events with respect to the role the RCMP played in residential schools. In 1899, the Indian Act allowed Indian agents to take school-aged children from their home and relocate them to residential schools. In 1931, RCMP became truant officers, allowing them to enforce the Indian Act. In 1945, the Family Allowance Act came into effect. It was used as an incentive to get Indigenous parents to enroll their children into residential schools. The RCMP enforced this act. In the 1980s, students began disclosing sexual and other forms of abuses, and the RCMP finally began to take the allegations seriously. The RCMP was responsible for enforcing the Indian Act and promoting the assimilation program. They were responsible for ensuring that Indigenous peoples observed Canadian laws and regulations set by the Indian Department. The Indian Act, first adopted in 1876, provided annuities for children. Agents would threaten to withhold annuities from parents if children were not voluntarily enrolled in residential schools. The RCMP conducted investigations and gave fines to parents whose children did not go to school. In 1920, the Indian Act was amended to make residential school attendance mandatory for Indigenous children aged 6 to 16 years. The children were forcibly brought to schools by the RCMP. Indigenous parents were forced to give up their children or be imprisoned. Parents could not intervene, take their children out of the schools, and were discouraged from visiting. Residential school survivors recount how the RCMP was used as a threat against their parents to force them to go to school. In 1945, the Family Allowance Act granted all Canadian parents a bonus to send their children to school. Records show that the RCMP was responsible for enforcing the act between 1947 and 1962. This allowance would be withheld from Indigenous parents and became a way to encourage them to send their children to residential schools. The RCMP received complaints by parents, students, and the Aboriginal community about children getting sick and dying, being overworked, poorly clothed, and inadequately fed at the schools. Parents also complained about the deficient education received in the schools, male staff misconduct towards female students, and other mistreatment. In 1933, the RCMP were designated as truant officers under the Indian Act and were responsible for enforcing attendance in residential schools. They became responsible for finding truants. Section 119 of the Indian Act gives the truant officers power, allowing the RCMP officers to enforce the Indian Act across the country. According to survivor accounts, the RCMP assisted in the search for truants by force. They would encircle reserves to prevent children from running and would go door to door gathering children despite the protest of parents. The children were then locked up in police stations or cattle pens until they could be taken to the residential schools. RCMP records show 230 cases of searches conducted for runaways between the 1930s and 1940s. Punishment at the residential schools included striking children. In the early 1990s, the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs sent a list of cases of possible abuse of students in residential schools. The cases were reviewed at divisional level, but no charges were laid by the RCMP, citing that the corporal punishment was common in residential schools and no investigation was necessary. Children in the residential schools were killed by disease, accidents, fires, and hurt by abuse. 60 investigations conducted by the RCMP between 1957 and 2005 with 619 victims identified 40 offenders. Over 360 charges were laid for crimes including gross indecency, indecent assault against male, sexual assault, contributing to juvenile delinquency, touching a person under the age of 14 for sexual purposes, traps to cause bodily harm, sexual interference, and assault causing bodily harm. The RCMP also investigated 15 cases of death and 1 attempted suicide. However, no charges were laid and the deaths were ruled accidental or illness-related. According to RCMP records, until the 1990s, sexual abuse was not reported by victims. Although records show that the RCMP were aware and had suspicions, few students complained to the RCMP before this time. Since 1990, there had been a number of former students who have alleged that they were abused while attending Indian residential schools. Former survivors did not report allegations of abuse to the RCMP due to embarrassment or fear of punishment by the residential school system. Even recently, many survivors have declined to press charges to avoid painful memories from their past. Survivors interviewed say they learned to fear and distrust the RCMP when they were very young. The RCMP were perceived as authority figures that took members of the community away from the reserves for wrongdoing. Most RCMP officers did not receive complaints about abuse from students during the time of the residential school system. Residential school survivors write about the difficulty in talking about the sexual abuse. Survivors explain that the school system did not allow them to contact the RCMP, and those who managed to do so did not get an adequate response. The RCMP were perceived as men in uniform that children couldn't talk to. They were scared of the RCMP because they represented authority. Supervisors would say that the children were lying and it would be difficult to prove their allegations to a higher authority. The general consensus among survivors is that the RCMP were used as a tactic to instill fear in children to prevent them from running away. The children were not informed about their rights and the role of institutions such as the RCMP. In recent years, RCMP crime prevention and social programs have been introduced to Indigenous school children. The current role of the RCMP in Indigenous communities strongly supports and encourages positive interactions and communication with community members. However, many Indigenous peoples still distrust the RCMP. Survivors say the RCMP should have gone to the schools and conducted investigations, been more visible, active, and should have been directed by the government or the church. They say that there should have been more help provided by the RCMP. Residential school survivors that know about past investigations blame the RCMP for not having conducted investigations at the time that they were abused. The investigations came too late, and the purpose of punishing the offenders was lost, as many had passed away. Many survivors, family members, and relatives passed away as well, and Indigenous cultural roots had been lost to the system.
In our current times, we still see the strained and complicated relationship that lives within the RCMP's involvement in controlling Indigenous bodies, specifically the current pushed enforcement from the government in building a pipeline on Indigenous lands. An example of the distrust is the stark difference in the approach the RCMP uses when policing Indigenous bodies protesting environmental devastation versus their approach in policing predominantly white settler action. Many counts of violent aggression can be seen in the way the RCMP approaches Unistoan on their land, and it causes one to question how far we've actually come. When comparing the behavior the RCMP uses in their response to the pipeline protests as opposed to the truck convoy that has been terrorizing civilians, it is apparent that the RCMP are much quicker to resort to force and violence when dealing with Indigenous bodies.